All right. I'll just, to keep us on track, I'll just start as people are slowly returning from their mini breaks. So this is the last panel of today, and we'll reconvene tomorrow a bit later, I think at 10:30, for our last two panels, or last panel, last two panels and keynote conversation. Maybe I'll just get right to it. So the decentering machine, and yeah, this was commented to me, but these descriptions and panelists and conversations again they're interchangeable. So I was just noticing that this one sounds a lot like the conversation that we just had, but this is an all artist panel, so that's exciting, or artist curator panel. So definitely a different perspective or expression of these questions and issues. But how do expanses of water, floods, and reclaimed shorelines unmake fixed identities, challenge or redefine sovereignty, and decolonize the map? A discussion of the oceanic as a decentering force represented in contemporary and community art practice. Our first presentation will be by Dr. Ayesha Hameed of Goldsmiths, University of London. Ayesha will talk about two projects. The first, Black Atlantis, that is winding down. So it's a 2014 to 2020 project. And the second project, Brown Atlantis, which started in 2020. Black Atlantis traces the afterlife of transatlantic slavery in the present, making connections to a legalized migration on the Mediterranean and how they relate to underwater ecologies below ships. Brown Atlantis extends this approach to explore the Indian Ocean world, ecologies, and histories of indentureship, looking at intertwined histories of Black and brown bodies and tracing their afterlives in the present moment. Our next presentation will be by Dr. Thea Quiray Tagle, University of Massachusetts, Boston. And Thea will discuss aesthetic and ethical practices of relationality and salvage in the West Philippine Sea through an examination of Dutch Filipina artist Martha Atienza's collaborative video projects with coastal indigenous peoples targeted by environmental racism and state violence in the Philippines' so-called war on drugs and war on terror. And sorry, I'm just realizing that I didn't print out your bios, but they are in the program if you wanted to grab one. And I do have a bio for Dr. Ayesha Guerin, so I'll introduce her because that's not in the program. But first I'll get to our last artist, Godard LAIWAN of Godard College, and also based here in so-called Vancouver, discusses her iterative project, How Water Remembers, which engages the interconnectedness of human and non-human habits to envision Vancouver as a city which connects to its shorelines through sensitive urban landscape and built environments to enhance biodiversity and future quality of life. It was LAIWAN who posted the City of Vancouver study on sea level rise that I then read and turned to in the succession of talks that led to the research in this symposium, led to the research that then led to the symposium. And side note, LAIWAN also founded Or Gallery as an artist project. So she's very much an indirect instigator and initiator of a lot of what's going on today over a very, very long term. So thanks for joining us. And panel respondents today for this panel will be Ayesha Guerin, who recently joined UBC and is also somewhat new to this city. So welcome. And sorry, Ayasha. Ayasha is an interdisciplinary artist, curator, and professor of Black diaspora studies in the Department of English Language and Literatures here at UBC. She's also a member of the Critical Image Forum research cluster at UBC. Ayasha's first book project, Making Zone A, Nature, Race, and Resilience on New York's most vulnerable shores, explores Black social life and ecology in the city's floodplain from the 17th to 19th centuries, tracing how colonial capitalism has cultivated a hierarchy of racial and species difference on urban landfill. It considers how activism on the waterfront has been shaped by diasporic relationships and interspecies entanglements. Her second project is focused on transnational Black feminism and arts activism in Berlin, Germany. And this summer, she'll be in Berlin teaching a course on Black art and literature based in that city. So I'd like to welcome first Ayesha. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for your patience and your energy at being here all day. I just want to say as a proviso, I've been up since 4 a.m. So if there's long pauses while I speak, please keep that in mind. I'm really honored, actually, and moved to be here. And to be part of the timely and important conversations taking place over this weekend. I feel like I've done something right because there's a lot of people in the room that I know already, and I also feel really grateful to have made new friends, so to see old and new friends here. I'm going to talk about two projects, as Denise said. The first, Black Atlantis, that's winding down, and the second, a project called Brown Atlantis, which I started in 2020. So Black Atlantis traces the afterlife of transatlantic slavery in the present, making connections to illegalized migration on the Mediterranean Sea. Brown Atlantis connects the histories of transatlantic slavery to the Indian Ocean world and histories of indentureship, trying to trace connections between Black and brown bodies and their afterlives in the present moment. In both projects, I use the image of an underwater Atlantis at the bottom of both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans to explore a set of speculative fictions. I use this alternate world to connect histories of slavery and indenture to the present and to make sense of migratory movements today. An underwater Atlantis also calls attention to the materiality of the oceans as living environments and how subaquatic human life might adapt, eroding the division between humans and non-humans. So the speculations of a brown and Black Atlantis are simultaneously explorations of a watery Anthropocene. My project, Black Atlantis, which I started in 2014, is a series of published texts, lecture performances, films, and sound works that looks at the Black Atlantic and its afterlives in contemporary legalized migration on the Med, in oceanic environments, through Afrofuturistic dance floors and sound systems, and in outer space. Using Walter Benjamin's concept of the dialectical image, I examine how to think through sound, image, water, violence, and history as elements of an active archive, and of time travel as a historical method. Black Atlantis combines two discourses, Afrofuturism and the Anthropocene. It follows a comment made by the geographer Phil Sternberg at a talk that I saw him give, where he talks about how discourses of the Black Atlantic focuses on the surfaces of the ocean rather than the depths of the water below. As a result, the wetness of the ocean is lost, and thus its haptic, tactile quality is lost as well. What below the water and Atlantis brings back then is the bottom of the sea, the volume of the water, and the materiality of the space of the ocean and other protagonists that inhabit the sea. One of the chapters in this project is a video called À l'ombre de nos fantômes, or In the Shadow of Our Ghosts, which I made with the Mauritanian and Senegalese artist Hameed Khan for the 2018 Dakar Biennial, and is actually a part of the streaming program or the screening program at Or Gallery right now. This film is in part about a ship that sailed in 2006 from Cape Verde to the Canary Islands and was found 4 months later off the coast of Barbados. The video also partly refers to Hameed's own experience of the time of walking across the Sahara Desert before crossing and claiming asylum in Europe several years ago. So I'm going to play you a short excerpt of this now. Okay, I'm here.
Maunisu, Mami Wata, Yemonja Kriti Kriti, Mbose, Makanga, Bunzi, Kambisi, Moana, Madre de Agua, Yemania, La Sirène, Madame Poisson, Mamba Muntu, Maman de l'eau, Maman de l'eau, Maman de l'eau, the soul, the water and the sun, both destroyed and preserved the bodies of these 11 men huddled together in the cabin. Mama Dilo. But they are a small fraction of the 40-odd men they set off with, who died and were washed overboard into the sea. Maman Dlo. Watra Mama. Through this, those bodies become something else. The forces of the sea, its salt water, wind, and sun corrugate and imbibe them. River Maiden. They make the bodies a part of the ravages of the sea and connect them to the others not seen that fell into the ocean. The sea, a force, fossilizes the bodies of these men who died on board, destroying and preserving them. The force of the sea winds and weather is insidious and complicit in the transformation of these dead men into fossils of the sea. They have become a part of the archive of sea, understandable in part only through the sea. Water Mama, Watra Mama, Maman de l'eau, Mama de l'eau, Maman de l'eau, Maman de l'eau, Mama de l'eau.
So one of the things we were thinking of, sort of to continue a thread of conversation from the previous panel, was how the figure of Mami Wata and her various sort of manifestations along the Americas and along the African coast formed a kind of techne to make sense of the crossing. So what we were sort of trying to do with these overlapping narratives is to sort of think about how the same story could be told through the story of the Orishas. And thinking also, of course, of how the weather and the rain were equal characters in this in the story of this crossing. So my new project, which I've somewhat unimaginatively called Brown Atlantis, and inadequately in ways that I could talk about later, extends the geography of Black Atlantis from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Black Atlantis looks at the Indian and Atlantic Oceans together as a site of both indentured and enslaved labor, and the imbrication in what Ruha Benjamin calls the technology of race. Brown Atlantis builds on Black Atlantis to study marine ecology, Afrofuturist imageries of underwater adaptation, and technologies of navigation, in a different configuration of the weather that takes into account the uniqueness of the Indian Ocean's trade winds and South-South exchange. So the first project I started working on this is called I Sing of the Sea, I Am Mermaid of the Trees, which was commissioned for the most recent Liverpool Biennial. And what it did is it followed the laying down of the first undersea telegraphic cable between India and Britain in the second half of the 19th century. This laying down of the cable was precipitated by the 6-week delay for Britain to get news of the outbreak of the revolt of 1857. The installation moves this history underwater, taking us to battles against the forces of the seafloor, through the fragile nervousness of cable signals, and imagining the forests in Sarawak, from where Gata Percha was extracted by indigenous peoples to insulate the thousands of miles of undersea cables as growing underwater. I Sing of the Sea considers how communication can act as a kind of violence, transmitted across the seafloor, consolidating Britain's imperial control over India. If Imperial Britain was the mother country and its colonies the offspring, then the undersea cable was a kind of pathological, strangulating umbilical cord. What I tried to do is tell a subaquatic story of those offspring.
Tawa roasted into chapati, from hand to hand, trembling, dawning revolt, 1857. Camel dyke, smoke signals, rumors, Brussels. It took 6 weeks. It took 6 weeks.
For news to travel, to control.
And so the wire electric, standing at the gallows, he calls the telegraph the noose that blocked the breath of revolt. It took 6 weeks. And so his neck broken, and another head in England grows cables like tentacles, singing the bottom of the sea. I sing the body electric. I sing the whispers gone quiet.
In 1870, telegraph cables connected India to Britain, turning 6 weeks into 9 minutes, flashing gold on the ocean floor, snaking dots and dashes.
Through forests I sing of fallen trees and crushed sedition.
So the installation consists of 20 floor-to-ceiling cyanotype prints of archival images of the Gata percha trees that were felled. The sound that you hear is a kind of stereo rendition of a 9-channel sound installation. I see I Sing of the Sea as a kind of prehistory to contemporary accounts of globalization and extractivism, thinking about the circulation of information in what the telegraphs and the chapatis, etc., were transmitting, as operating alongside the infrastructural development of the telegraph, thinking about the movement of peoples, goods, and information as intertwined, but inhabiting different spatio-temporalities. To me, what I was trying to highlight, which parts of the world, once again, are extracted from, and the clash of different epistemic and spiritual relationships to nature that come into play in that clash. The final project I'm going to talk about stays with this idea of communication and oceanic space as being intertwined. And this is in the form of a radio show that I host, that I have been hosting since 2020. It's called Radio Brown Atlantis, and it's broadcast on the Onassis Foundation's Movement Radio website, radio station, sorry, which is a great radio station, and Radio Al-Hara in Palestine, also a really great radio station. In each episode, I invite practitioners in the field of sonic art, music, and performative thought from different parts of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans to basically have a jam session on what a brown Atlantis might look or sound like. We play music, we read poetry, we tell stories, and we see where the conversation takes us. In collaboration with the guests, we're developing the first season into an exhibition at Bonniers Konsthal in Stockholm, taking as its premise that a brown Atlantis is cartographically unmappable, and that the sounds and textures of an improvisational radio show cannot be fully made visible. I've been thinking about how to consider migrations in the Indian Ocean as operating in parallel with legacies of transatlantic slavery, and trying to think about sort of cosmopolitanism as operating at sea level, manifest in the exchange of songs, ideas, cultures, running again in tandem, in opposition to the global economic flows. And then finally thinking about radio as a means with which to amplify this already existing cosmopolitanism. So I'm going to play some excerpts for you of some of the conversations I had. The first one I'm going to play is a conversation I had with the artist Sanchintya Mohini Sampson, who is based in Australia. And we had this conversation. I'm trying to see, this font is very small here. Maybe I'll look up here. That might be a bit easier. On the 30th of April in 2021. So I'll just play that now.
My family were taken from South India, from the port of, what was then called Madras, then taken to Natal, which is now KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And then from there, they were sent to sugar plantations to work. There was industries of fishing and many different forms of labor, not just the sugar industries there, but obviously, they were taking people to work on, sugar colonies, cheap labor. And then my mother was brought up during apartheid in South Africa, and she actually left on the last South African Airways flight from South Africa to Australia during apartheid. So there's that, I think, and I was sort of born here, and I think being aware of something really that wasn't discussed a lot, this history, a lot of shame surrounding this history, with our old people not telling these stories or telling them very secretly. And this, I think, was really brought to the forefront for my mother and myself when I was just making work, trying to understand my relationship with my mother, the experiences my family had experiencing racism in Australia, experiences of sort of not belonging and being displaced, and this idea of intergenerational trauma, because I sort of, what happened to these women? They all had these parallel experiences, through each generation of women, and there's just something that's being passed down. Like, there's that culture, there's some incredible, amazing things that are being passed down with the women, but there's these cultural expectations from a place that we're disconnected from, but we're always part of. But also there's sort of this trauma, or there was this other thing, mental illness, or there was this sort of part of it that I didn't understand, and that picture wasn't fully there for me.
The second excerpt, sorry, I'll say that again. The second excerpt I'm going to play to you is from a conversation I had with the artist Shudavrata Sengupta, which was on the 28th of May in 2021. And that date is somewhat significant, as you'll see when I play this. But I was really thinking about one thing that sort of got stuck in my head in the last few days, was thinking about, the ways in which water and images of bodies of water get mobilized within political discourses, but also that they're not just metaphors, they actually are quite literal. So what got stuck in my head just, in the kind of the last week was this chant that you hear at all the demos in the last week, which is from the river to the sea. I'm thinking about this imaginary of a Palestinian homeland that would actually encompass the borders of the Jordan to the Mediterranean, and this is not a rhetorical thing. So I was thinking about that image, or that mobilization, because it's very powerful to hear it from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. And then, of course, thinking about the Ganga and this sort of slowly, like it's almost like this slow car crash of watching the Kumbh Mela sort of take place and knowing all the kinds of the casualties that would happen, and of course the same, like almost like the violence of a Benjaminian dialectical image is like people worshipping at the Ganga and then dying, and then people who died, whose bodies have then been thrown. So I feel like there's something about these two bodies of water, from the river to the sea, as a kind of defiance against this horrific sort of flattening that we've seen in the last 10 days or so, and then this sort of image of death and how it's slowly unfolded in a way that everybody could predict it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" has been in all our minds in the last week or so, or even before that. I mean, I've always, whenever the word Palestine comes up, sort of unspoken is "from the river to the sea," and I've always thought of that as something not just about Palestine, but it actually describes a way of inhabiting the world, which is between different kinds of flows and currents. So if there's a riverine flow and then there's a maritime current. The Ganga images that we see are actually now of two kinds. There are bodies that have been floated in the river. And then there are burials by the riverside in the sand, which is people who cannot afford to build funeral pyres, who are digging them shallow graves in the sand. And as the wind and the river actually acts upon the riverbank, these burials are getting exposed. So there's that remarkable image that I saw again today of a man walking. So it's taken from a drone. You can see one man walking on the riverbank. It's gray sand. There's a tiny figure, and there are these little rectangular patches, which are the bodies that have become sort of half uncovered because of the action of the wind. And the fact that, you know, the river becomes like a resting place for people, which is both an extremely touching and a poignant thing, but also incredibly dangerous, because these are all, again, vectors of infection.
In the interest of time, I'm not going to say too much about these clips and wait till the conversation, but I just want to end with a final clip, which was a conversation I had with the poet Shivani Ramlochan, who is based in Trinidad, and she opens the episode with reading one of her poems called "Witch Hindu."
Witch Hindu. Curry nipple, shrapnel bindi, lassi whiplash, linga language, rum-proof cane field, erotic indenture, henna pregnancy, golden roti, chocolate kajal, pagan burial, choke me kindly in these archives, camphor moth bites, grandmother's saris, drowning dowry, wield the mace and master me. This is not a burning. These are not white spells. Witch Hindu walks everywhere on blue-throated feet, scattering febrile cockheads, emptying all bad seed. Witch Hindu knows your atmosphere, can taste it in the charnel house your kind raped my kind adjacent to, without a single prayer for the irradiated skin. Oh, Witch Hindu promises you will not be able to think of sorries. in the land where reparations are drawn first from the battlements of your thighs, O descendants of sailors and minstrels, of thanes and thieves and the kin who walk upright and never permit their girlfriends to come. Which Hindu has a ceremony for you under the cutlass of her tongue, gathering all the hymens of indenture in her forearms as ribboning hurricanes, glowering pregnant, growing Darjeeling and Lanet and rum. Mortuary deer, guillotine, coal, grandfather's cutlass, hidden beef, halogenic bone shards, India disgorged. These archives kindly choke in me. Consummation dagger, turban death mask, holy porn shop, hunted bride, translucent elephant, trampling down. These are not white burnings. This is not your spell.
I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for bearing with me as I got the tech together. I'm Thea, Quiray, Tagle. I'm sharing just a small portion of one chapter of a manuscript in progress that's titled Afterlife, Trans-Pacific Ethics and Aesthetics of Salvage and Relation. In each of the chapters, I'm exploring the modes by which Asian diasporic, indigenous, and/or Filipinx contemporary artists and performers utilize particular strategies to illuminate or to cover, in different cases, modes of environmental racism, state violence, extrajudicial violence, and other kinds of racialized harm against indigenous communities and Black communities across the Pacific. This chapter in particular, I'm thinking about surfacing, right? Surfacing from the deep and moving within the ocean, and the practice of Dutch Filipinx artist Martha Atienza as a particular mode that slows down time and helps us see differently, feel differently, think differently, to understand the multiple forms of violence that render apart Indigenous communities in the Philippines who are battling, different forms of extractivism, as well as extrajudicial killings under the current presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. And I did want to say too, thank you so much to Denise and the other organizers for inviting me to this conversation. I'm very much in awe of everyone that's come before and everyone that's coming after. And I'm really thrilled to contribute a little bit to this conversation today. Just a warning, several of the images at the beginning are of some of the salvaging or the killing of people in the Philippines. I won't dwell on them long, but they are important to the larger argument. Since the 2016 election inauguration of Rodrigo Duterte into the presidency of the Philippines, an archipelago-wide war on drugs and war on terror have sanctioned the deaths of tens of thousands of Filipino people. The ICC has estimated between 12,000 and 30,000 people in the Philippines were killed between 2016 and 2019 alone, numbers which are surely underreported. These deaths have made international headlines with award-winning photo essays by American, European, and Filipino photojournalists such as these, which have captured sensational photo and video footage of urban poor, indigenous fisher folk and land defenders, and Muslim folks who've been killed by extrajudicial and paramilitary forces riding in tandem on motorbikes. These images have circulated alongside others, highlighting Filipino resiliency through typhoons, floods, earthquakes, and other natural disasters, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, of which the Philippines has had some of the highest rates in the world due to government corruption and mismanagement of vaccines. This ongoing crisis in the Philippines has become even more acute, as just last week, the seats of the Philippine presidency, and vice presidency have been secured or stolen by Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte, the son of the late dictator, whose 13-year martial law period was ousted by the People Power Revolution of 1986, and the daughter of the outgoing president, whose violations of human rights are possibly even higher than the dictators. Excuse me. I'm a Capricorn, I do not cry in public. The past suffering of the Filipino people under dictatorship and despotism will return and be intensified with this new regime, which prevailed in the Philippine elections despite the copious eyewitness and photographic evidence of Marcos and Duterte's crimes. It seems that despite the regime of proof afforded by photographs of the present-day drug war and during the longue durée of the martial law period, the disinformation campaigns vis-a-vis social media and right-wing news outlets have won over the Philippine public's attention. And this isn't to blame the public, right? There's been so much systemic voter intimidation, broken machines, et cetera, that have led to this result. Looking away from these over-circulated photographs of Filipino death, I want to turn our gazes towards Our Islands from 2018, which is a 2-channel experimental video by Filipino-Dutch artist Martha Atienza. In this collaboratively made durational work, time is slowed down underwater, inviting viewers to tarry with life. In the simultaneously terrible and sublime liquidity of the Visayan Sea, non-normative Filipino bodies continue to breathe and move, albeit with difficulty, within a seascape blighted by natural and unnatural decay. The video's excruciating slowness, borrowing from Tina Camp's writing In a Black Gaze, is, quote, an opening to linger durationally in the small, in details, and reflection, to intensify our perception of any outcome, end quote. And so as I want to share an abbreviated format here and in more depth in the book chapter from which this is adapted, I'm interested in the ways that the formal qualities and the collaborative genesis of Our Islands labors to make visible the entanglement of seemingly disconnected forms of environmental and social violence in the Philippine archipelago. And in this video, I argue, we're invited to witness and to learn from indigenous and queer people who have been produced by the Philippine state as salvageable, yet who persist in living otherwise. So just to begin with a bit of why I'm using this word salvage. Salvage is a word with double entendre. Its most familiar and common usage is as an act of rescue, specifically of rescuing cargo and objects from a wreck at sea. In the Philippine-specific usage, salvage is a verb that evokes the dismemberment or rendering apart of bodies. It was a euphemism coined during the martial law reign of dictator Ferdinand Marcos to signal the extrajudicial apprehension, torture, and execution of enemies of the state, and the dumping of their dead bodies into public streets and waterways in spectacular acts of state power. In recent years, salvaging has surfaced again as a term to describe the drug war-related extrajudicial killings that have been rendered sublime by Filipino photojournalists, colloquially known as the night crawlers. And Ezra Kayan specifically is the photographer who's captured these particular images. In images like these, crime scenes are shot with extreme close-ups of the victims, which are taken at ground level, while images taken at funerals are tilted at exaggerated high or low angles that make the dead monumental, while transforming into indiscernible masses, their family and friends that they've left behind to survive in these ongoing twin war on drugs and war on terror. These images have circulated rapidly throughout social media and international news media. You know, they've won Pulitzer Prizes, international World Press Prizes, et cetera. And while these images have successfully captured global attention for brief spans of time, They cannot offer us a deeper analysis of the multiple causes behind these killings, which exceed these frequently used simplistic explanations of the drug wars as simply being about purging the urban poor from public space. In contrast to the salvage aesthetics of the night crawlers, however, artist Martha Atienza has created a series of video works that operate at the other register of salvage, that of resurrecting from the deep. Born in Madridejos on Bantayan Island to a seafaring father and a Dutch mother, Martha has a unique insider perspective on the lives and deaths of the island's inhabitants and works intentionally and relationally with them to perform a slow-moving critique of the multiple entanglements leading to the violence and their deaths. In Our Islands, which won the 2018 Berlin Bear, Atienza collaborated with compression divers as well as festival performers. Where'd it go? Sorry, a page disappeared. A festival performers of Bantayan Island, to offer a stunning durational performance of figures drawn from myth and multiple Philippine realities that were first conceived for the island's annual Ati-Atihan Festival, typically held in January every year. In the looping 1 hour, 12-minute video, compression divers labor to present tableaus that uniquely braid together the difficult realities of life on Bantayan Island. So a few maps, just so you can place the place. Located in the Visayan Sea, northwest of Cebu Island, across the Tinyon Strait, Bantayan Island is a small island of 108.77 square kilometers, or 42 square miles, that has in the 20th century become a pass-through zone for shipping boats moving goods between Manila, from Mindanao and Cebu City on their way north to Manila. While the island is beginning to grow in popularity as a tourist attraction for its white sand beaches, Bantayan Islanders have historically been fisher folk, with the Visayan Sea being known as Cebu's fishing grounds. As practices of fishing with cyanide and dynamite have irreparably harmed the coral reefs, which are home to many fish species, and rising ocean temperatures have increased the severity of typhoons that have hit land, Bantayan Islanders in economic distress have begun to outmigrate from the country at increasing pace to work in the global seafaring and shipping industries as domestic workers and home health aides, and for construction jobs in places as far-flung as Saudi Arabia and Dubai. Those who remain on island out of choice or necessity are tasked with maintaining connections with migrants abroad and with their communities at home. The annual Ati-Atihan Festival, pictured on the left, which celebrates the Santo Niño or Infant Jesus, is one such site of rebuilding collective cohesion while being a generative and creative space for expelling repressed communal fears and anger. For the festival's main event, islanders dress as mythical, religious, or other cultural characters to participate in a procession through the town streets. And in the revelry of the festival, community members are given license to express themselves, desires, discontents in ways impossible in other times. And so, wishing to extend the temporality of their critique, Atienza moves this procession to a spectacle that happens undersea. And this is an installation shot of how it's meant to be presented as a two-channel. And this is from the Taiwan International Biennial in 2018. I'll show a couple of stills and then I'll let the video run while I'm talking. As expected of a Catholic-themed festival with pagan or syncretic elements woven throughout, we witnessed divers here in costumes of Catholic priests and penitents who hold small statues of the Santo Niño and other religious icons while walking over a breached coral seascape. Other divers take their cues from trans femmes or bakla men who perform annually in the Ati-Atihan and proceed in drag versions of the Mother Mary and important secular women in the Philippines, such as OFWs, overseas domestic workers, symbolized in part by carrying a femme carrying a large black suitcase. Popular culture figure and boxer, now politician Manny Pacquiao, is represented by a diver, alternates between swimming and boxing maneuvers. And two other tableaus, which we've already seen a preview of, are more overtly political in design and borrow directly, again, from the repertoires of the Ati-Atihan performers. In this first, a Typhoon Yolanda survivor from the 2014 storm is examined by a nurse. The survivor holds a sign signaling their identity for those who don't understand the reference. And Typhoon Yolanda did impact the Bantayan Islands quite hard with little, remuneration, rebuilding anything happening on island. Finally, and most distressingly, a diver attempts to escape, becoming another casualty of the drug war. A cardboard sign around their neck reads, "Drug lord ako, wag tularan, don't kill me," as is typical for the real-life victims of salvaging in the Philippines. Yet unlike the drug war victims who are already dead when captured on camera, this person remains ahead of their would-be killers. They are dressed incongruously as a ballerina or an angel in white bikini, gray tights, and a large crown on their head, and are closely pursued in painful slowness by figures clad in all black camouflage gear with semi-automatic weapons. The precarity of the scenes that unfold before us are multiple and exceed mere representations of violence. Crossing the liminality of the undersea, the divers always already, right, because they're subsistence divers. Whoops, wrong way. The divers already inhabit a zone between life and death, as risking their lives daily in underwater exertions beyond typical human capacity. Although they look effortless in their spectacular performances for Atienza's camera, their mundane exertions for subsistence and commercial fishing always require complex choreography of breath and movement that makes them vulnerable to drowning and other forms of death. The divers' constant proximity to danger manifests clearly at several moments in this video, when strong currents or waves threaten their body's control and risk pushing them upwards or off screen. At different moments in the video, we can visibly witness disruptions to the scene's false placidity. Most notably, a person dressed as an OFW in a flower purple dress struggles with a large black suitcase that's burdensome and heft in bulk. Between their first and second appearance on screen, the divers lost their fins and reverses their orientation of holding their suitcase, which are small details that point to the necessary shifting and improvising divers do in real time in order to continue their laborious work. Watching our islands or other prior and following video works made by Martha on Bantayan Island, we as viewers become witness to Indigenous and poor peoples living in the wake of human and more than human death without being forced to endure the sight of violence directly. There's even perhaps a sense of voyeurism and complicity that's embedded when the gallery is installed, or the video is installed in a gallery. Two projectors placed on the floor of a gallery throw life-scaled images to two large plexiglass or glass screens placed in front of them. Walking past or standing in front of projections, viewers encounter the performance life-size as they would large sharks or endangered mammals in an aquarium, separated only by thin glass membrane. As it is, dwelling alongside, viewers are encouraged to linger and ruminate on unfolding in quiet, as this piece has no sound, for as long as we can bear witness. Over time, spending time, our senses become overwhelmed by the submarine knowledge that enfolds participants and witnesses in wet embrace. The fear and anger at the forced disappearance and killings of the poor, Indigenous land defenders, and Moro separatists caught up in the drug war. The anxiety over loss of livelihood by ocean acidification and other effects of climate change, along with the destructive practices of commercial trawling and cyanide fishing used in desperation by subsistence fisherfolk, and the sadness and displacement of kinship ties through the global migration of OFWs. Viewers also witness the ingenuity of the poor in crafting new fantastic personas, the drama and creativity of queer performers in choreographing complex scenes, and joys of drag performances that are always slightly sacrilegious. In this underwater Atiatihan procession, the full duality of salvage aesthetics becomes animated and articulated. Collective and collaborative forms of everyday people attempting to salvage or rescue memories of environmental damage and social death from state regimes committed to forgetting, even as they walk over coral beds for the performance, and this walking itself causes additional damage and salvages or renders apart the very same natural environment they are fighting to protect from state and corporate extractive industries. This durational performance of salvage does come with its rewards: international representation at art exhibitions, more exposure for the plight of Bantayan Islanders, that perhaps outweighs the risk to its creators and to the underwater ecosystems on which they tread. As Martha Atienza has said of our islands, quote, "They're fighting underwater. It shows survival. As they push through the currents, they themselves destroy what they live off of," end quote. So by way of conclusion, our islands doesn't merely represent the barriers to thriving that islanders face, but is a project that manifests both the generative and the destructive qualities of Indigenous peoples' necessary survival strategies. The seascape that's the stage of this performance is not only or simply a metaphorical index of overland sites where racial capitalism accumulates, but is itself an important material location where people living through genocidal conditions of state violence and multinational resource extractivism are made and unmade. In their day jobs as fisher folk, the compression divers in our islands are implicated as being ongoing and unwitting contributors to the ecological destruction poetically depicted in the video. The bleached corals are mute evidence to the damage that dynamite fishing practices utilized by divers has brought, while the divers trampling on this dying seabed for this video compounds the damage. Yet as the performance dramatizes in this projection, fisher folk and other working class Filipino people are the most minor of players in the larger drama of state and corporate designs on the sea. And the people are the only defenders fighting to keep further underwater drilling, speculative investment, and beachfront construction from fully decimating both the marine ecosystem and local ways of life over land. Moreover, the collective labor of generating and maintaining trust, connection, and cooperation for the execution of this project is in itself an example example of what's required to survive throughout risk, vulnerability, and a shared commitment to teaching each other how to breathe and how to be. In this profoundly relational performance, our island creates an endless loop of Indigenous survivance that exceeds mere survival or resilience. It repeats like refrain the militant Indigenous endurance of queered subjects who have trained each other to exist in hostile environments with different capacities of breath, movement, and labor. Their mutual efforts, care, and collective actions performed underwater are acts that can and are rearticulated on land in order to survive the multiply murderous conditions of environmental and social salvaging that determine human and more than human life and death across the archipelago. Witnessing slowly, might we too be trained by the Bantayan Islanders in collaborative ways of living otherwise in our own worlds and contexts, which remain deeply rendered by the violence of salvage. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm blown away by all the presentations today. They're very intense and deep. So thank you, Thea and Ayesha. Thank you, Denise, for inviting me, and to all the organizers. I really appreciate being able to be here today. I would like to acknowledge that I live and work here in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I was born in apartheid Rhodesia in the 60s, and I'm of Chinese descent. My parents were from the Toisanese region. I'm committed to decoloniality, in particular to the Indigenous peoples of Canada, what is called Canada. Today, my talk is going to look at the last 7 years of research that has brought about the latest iteration, which is called How Water Remembers. I'll begin with the first image. Let's see. So around 2015, I was walking as I do around the city, and I was trying to think about questions of how does a city flow? How is a city's design made for human flow, but also the flow of other habitats and other creatures? I found this image, not this image, but an image similar to it online, and I didn't know where it was. And it was very haunting to me. For some reason, I didn't know why it was haunting to me. The following year, I got commissioned to do a project called I named it Fountain, the source of origin of anything. And discovered that before I get there's what I call the ground zero. Ground zero for me is Kiefer and Columbia Streets, which is in Chinatown. So this is a view south on Kiefer and Columbia Streets. And we can see that in 1961, the image on my left is exactly the same place as the image on the right, which is Kiefer and Columbia Street. So in 1961, that is where the waters of False Creek used to flow up to behind Chinatown, behind what is now the Sun Yat-sen Gardens. Oops. So part of the residency for creating Fountain was at the CBC building, which is on Hamilton Street. And there they have they have an analog media library, and working with the analog media archivist, Colin Preston, and the curator, Joni Lowe, I asked Colin, do you know where this image is? And it is of the Georgia Viaduct, what's called the Georgia Viaduct today. So part of my work is about how do you create discourse around specific areas of the city, and in particular, this question about flow. And it began my interest in looking at what I'm calling ground zero, which is Columbia and Kiefer Streets, and where the waters of False Creek used to come up to Chinatown. So in a book called Vancouver, A Visual History, we see two maps here. One is from the 1950s, where we see the False Creek that went up to Chinatown. And then in the 1980s, that little strip has disappeared. And in the next one, before contact, this is the whole False Creek area and the intertidal zone. And the intertidal zone that includes where Emily Carr sits today. So Colin Preston gave me a film that was made in 1956 from the CBC. It's called Summer Afternoon, and it kind of very loosely explores the adventures of two boys running through Chinatown. So I'm going to play a little clip of that. Hopefully. I guess here we go. There is no audio, and there's little moments of frozen images like there. But we see the Georgia Viaduct behind, and in this moment, the two boys are running down to the waters of False Creek, as it once came up behind Chinatown. Now, this film was made by a director who picked these two boys out from a crowd in a church, well, churchgoers, on a Sunday. He just picked the two boys out in a very informal audition and said, you know, we'll follow you running around and playing in Chinatown. These two boys were not friends with each other, but they were told to be friends in this film. And as you will see in the next scene, we're told to jump into a boat and, sorry, there's a scene missing, but they jump into a boat and row in it. But who in today allow their kids to be running around Chinatown and jumping into a boat that doesn't belong to them? So we see the landscape, the cityscape is very different from what we know today. Part of this project also became a set of poems that was published in the Northeast Falls Creek Public Art Plan. So part of my strategies as an artist is how to insert myself into city systems. And the poems were inspired by the glossary of water quality terms. So these little haikus are in there. And as Rita had mentioned earlier, the hidden streams of Vancouver was also part of the conversation in some of the public discussions for Fountain. The next project that I worked on, well, there's a number of other projects, but Mobile Barnacle City was a school and studio and a bus that parked itself at Kiefer and Columbia Streets. So barnacles are a metaphor that I explore in a different project called Barnacle City, and you can see Barnacle City on my website, and it's about a 90-second movie. It's called Barnacle City, the movie. It's a spoof on movies. My mini action movie, and the mini action movie of barnacles being, you know, great action stars. So this bus is called Sight Factory. It was a gallery on a bus, and it was the perfect vehicle for exploring Kiefer and Columbia Streets. So this field is called Andy Livingston. It's the soccer fields next to Andy Livingston Park, which is just behind the Sun Yat-sen Gardens. And most parks and most fields used to be water. And the reason why they're parks and fields is because they're too soft to build on. So these soccer fields are actually astroturfed, but the original False Creek waters are under there, where the boys ran down to play or to jump in the boat is exactly this spot. Part of the programming on the bus was working with C. Swice and Anne Riley, who gave workshops and salons on indigenous plants. And another workshop was working with one of the two boys. So one of the things that the archivist said to me is, oh, you should find Chipamar. So Chipamar is the boy on the far left. And so I put word out about 6 months after the project, and I said, I'm looking for this fellow who was in this movie in 1956. And it took a while, but about maybe 9 months after I put word out, I got an email saying, I know where Chipe is. And then it took about another 7 months before finally I got the phone call that said, yeah, he's ready to meet you now. And as luck would have it, he lived around the corner from me. So he's now 72. And so part of my strategies is also to find the elders that are part of this narrative. And so there's the bus parked at Kiefer and Columbia. So this brings us to the current project, which is How Water Remembers. And again, it's based in that area. As Denise mentioned, the research about sea level rise in Vancouver and how in 100 years it's going to look a bit like that. So all the light blue areas is what's going to flood, which includes parts of Chinatown and includes parts of this side of False Creek. And actually, it's all the places where it used to be. So here are two quotes that are part of the project. Up the stretch of False Creek, the man and monster drove their course, where a century hence great city bridges were to overarch the waters. And that's E. Pauline Johnson. And the second quote, you know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally the river floods these places. Floods is the words they use, but in fact it is not flooding, it is remembering where it used to be. So my project was interested in how to create a speculative, different imagining of this area. And because the Falls Creek waters or the possible flooding was shaped like a dragon, I thought, okay, let's play with a dragon image. So the first iteration of this project was shown in an exhibition that was called Rivers Have Mouths, Indigenous and Chinese Canadian Art Exchange that was at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens. If you go to the Art Gallery today, these banners are displayed there. These are two stanzas from the beginning of two different chapters from the Tao Te Ching. And you know, one of them in English would say, true goodness is like water. What is good for everything? It doesn't compete. The translations are by Ursula Le Guin. And the second one is, what's softest in the world rushes and runs over what's hardest in the world. So of course, in classical Chinese, you read far right down, and it goes that way. So this project, I have 19 guardians, critter guardians, intertidal guardians, along with the dragon mother. So there's a story that I devised about the dragon mother returning to Chinatown, and upon the flood, and to protect us. And with the dragon mother comes 19 guardians. And these guardians are the great blue heron, the Olympic oyster, pickleweed, glasswort, western sandpiper, Lingby sedge, Dungeness crab, river otter, biofilm, Lewis's moon snail, moonglow anemone, Nootka rose, ocean spray, starry flounder, Pacific littleneck, wood duck, tool, Pacific heron, Pacific herring, harbor seal, and sunflower sea star. So these critters you can see within the text, but you can also see some of them are repeated because the way the Chinese language is written. I don't read Chinese. I worked very closely with a translator, but it's very fascinating how the Chinese language imagines things. There's also a story which you will find on my website, which was shared generously by C. Weiss, and it's the story of Sinulke. And Sinulke is a sea serpent that figures very prominently in the Squamish cosmology. So I encourage you to also look up the story of Sinulke, and it's also at the Art Gallery on one of the banners. So as luck would have it, you can collect these critters. This project was supported by this card side project was supported by the City of Vancouver Sustainability Group, and they funded the printing of the cards. How this works is, well, before we get there, of course, as abundance has it, a great blue heron arrived at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens and has been living there. I first sighted her in October 2021. But she's still there, and she's beautiful. She's like 3 feet high, and she's not afraid of humans. And yeah, when I see her, it's just an astounding hopefulness. So there are 20 stores in Chinatown who each have a card. And if you want to have a deck, I encourage you to visit each one of these stores. I'll let you know in a minute how you can do that. Chinatown has always been imagined, I think, by the Western imagination as an exotic place, a place for tourism. But actually, it is a ghetto that is evidence of survival. The incredible exclusion and discriminatory racist policies of Canada upon the Chinese and the Asian population, and in particular, the acceleration of anti-racism sentiment during the pandemic, which rose by 700% in Vancouver, which is astounding. So Chinatown has been besieged for decades now, with deliberate impoverishment and gentrification. And so part of the challenge for this project was how to work with a community in a respectful way, but also one that could benefit them, while also, and I'm talking about businesses that were struggling, that are struggling and continues to struggle, and how to make a participatory public engagement project that would also acknowledge the challenges of the elders and the citizens living in Chinatown. So a good example of this is the vegetable lady who is next to the ore, and her name's Amy. And you might notice that the last few weeks she hasn't been there. And a few weeks ago, her stall was firebombed. So she hasn't been there for a little while. We're looking for her. So the card that she has is the Mother Dragon card. And we're going to try and figure out how to enable Mother Dragon cards to be available and then collect money to give to her. So Sean Zhao is the fellow there who is my community engagement liaison person in Chinatown, who helped me set up the 20 stores. And part of this is also, how do we change the imagination of Chinatown itself about the possible return of intertidal critters and other species, creating a possibility for other habitats in this place called Chinatown. So some of the other participating stores, and the seamstress to the far left, her stall has also closed. So we're going to have to figure out how to also raise some funds for her. So on Google Maps, there's a way for you to find all the 20 stores. And there were also 10 bus shelters. And I'm going to put out some free cards that people can take. And encourage you to share them out on this here. So there's a large number of folks who contributed to this project, and there's a QR code for getting the divination game. So if you collect all the cards, you can play the divination game. That's also downloadable. And the key question for me is always, how do we create alternative narratives that also encourage and embody spaces for the multi-species critters. And if we want to deal with climate change, we also need to be thinking about protecting habitat that's not human exceptionalism or extractivism. So yeah, I don't have time to acknowledge all the artists who are in the project, but I do want to acknowledge that the person who worked on all the illustrations is Colleen Harvey, and the back of the card illustration is by the artist Marlene Ewan. But thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ayesha Guerin. Before I start speaking, I just want to acknowledge that we've all been sitting for a long time, so I just want to give like 30 seconds for people to get up and stretch if they need to, and maybe like do some twisting or, you know, reaching. Just keep the body connected to the mind. Cool. It's really an honor to be here and to share a stage with so many incredible speakers today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and sometimes your pain and your healing processes. It's been, I've been sitting here all day thinking that this is the symposium that I've been looking forward to for, you know, the last 10 years of my life. So thank you. So I'm just going to respond with a couple of things that I'm thinking about, and I'm going to make some connections to or between the ideas that I've heard today. And so a fact that I think about quite often is that globally today, 50% of humanity lives within 60 kilometers of the coast. And many of these people live in port cities that became rich through histories of slavery and colonization. And as spaces of interspecies interdependencies, I'm interested in histories of the shoreline because they often tell us stories of environmental and social perseverance in the face of wild exploitation. And so those human and more than human lives that have been devalued and contained and exploited by urban design and development at the shoreline, all of those lives are in relation. And I'm interested in looking at those relations, right? And my own thinking, which builds on the insights of Sylvia Wynter and other African diasporic critics who, rather than appealing for recognition and inclusion in a cis heteropatriarchal concept of the human, argue the inherent anti-Blackness of this project. And so I found it particularly helpful to focus on how we have historically lived in organized symbiosis with other species, and how we might salvage these intergenerational relations. One example that I come back to a lot in my work is the example of African-American oystermen in the New York Harbor, who at the beginning of the 19th century, when New York was experiencing its first oyster collapse, the harbor saw a sort of influx of African-American oystermen who were escaping the slave states of the South, and they brought with them oyster spats, and they replanted oysters into the harbor, and the oysters came back for a bit. Of course, before they came, right? I mean, New York was known as one of the most oyster-rich habitats in the world before the colonization by European powers. And the Lenape people and Canarsie people and other indigenous families of the area had for thousands of years acted as stewards of the oyster community in New York. And so at the end of the 19th century, when a bunch of exclusionary laws that used race, the language of race, to decide who could and couldn't harvest at these in these oyster reefs, what we saw was that both African-American oystermen were out of jobs, and we saw that a lot of people had to leave New York. But at the same time, the oysters were re-exploited, and the waters were polluted. And as a result, a couple years later, by the turn of the 20th century, you could no longer eat the oysters in the harbor. So more often than not, under these extractive processes of colonial capitalism, we who fall outside the category of man find ourselves in the same boat, right? Navigating, as Kito Swan said, as racialized anxieties of waterways. And so scholars from the fields of island studies and ocean studies have made important and convincing arguments for the engagement of urban scholars with the waters surrounding shorelines and islands. And so it seems quite clear to me, and I think to a lot of people at this conference, that in order to advance these ocean studies projects, acknowledgement of how historical constructions of racial difference have influenced the assemblages of human and non-human relationships to act upon each other is really necessary. And so looking forward, this will mean connecting processes of climate change, storm surges, and sea level rises to being driven by these extractive relationships to women, to queer people, to Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, First Nations, and other Indigenous communities, as well as non-human species. And so a couple of years ago, when I was writing my dissertation on the Zone A of New York, which is the 100-year flood zone, and what LAIWAN referred to as ground zero, right? I was feeling kind of hopeless and kind of frustrated about the state of things, the state of the world, and the promise of sea level to rise and swallow the communities I care for. And this kind of mantra kept creeping into my head, and the mantra was something like, something new will come from the water, like something else will come from the water, something has to come from the water that we don't know about yet, right? And I began to see the ocean as this place of regeneration and a place of unknown depths and unknowable species, and a place from which all life on land once came, right? So also a place of hope. And as wetlands and as these sea ecologies migrate into our neighborhoods, right, and onto the coast with sea level rise, we might ask, how might we welcome them, right? And so we have to think about this in spaces of design practice and in spaces of policy practice, also spaces of education and art. And it's also a question that has already been posed today by other speakers. Karamia Muller said, how might we envision the potential of rising waters as revealing and restoring the presences and relations lost or almost lost to colonial forms of dispossession. And our speakers today have also invited us to think in alliance and in solidarity with the oceanic and the non-human and the sort of multi-species perspective. And Dr. Hameed's work, I think, also supported a sort of reading, which is one that I've been thinking with as well, of the environments of the ship or of boats as a sort of extension of the precarity that is experienced in the urban floodplain, right? A place to study socio-ecological relationships between vulnerable social groups. And I really loved how you are attending to the violence of these sort of colonial communication technologies with your project, the Movement Radio project, which is connecting histories of exploitation and migration and labor histories and decolonization movements. I think this speaks really nicely to some of those questions that opened this panel, which I'll get back to at the end of this. And Dr. Quiray Tagle's work, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for introducing us to our islands and the violence of salvage in the Philippines. It's it's very important work. And I think that what you showed us is also an example of an artist thinking with the ocean as an archive of socio-ecological exploitation, right? And that I loved when you said, they're destroying what they live off of, right? And this represents the complex survival conditions of Indigenous peoples, both in the Philippines and around the world. And LAIWAN, your question that you opened your presentation with, how does a city flow? Such a beautiful question. And this art practice of how do I insert myself into city systems, right? And how do I bring a sort of ecological memory into that work? It's very, very moving. And this speculative practice that you spoke to me about earlier at lunch, that's put into practice in the How Water Remembers project, is also a practice of reaching towards and connecting to what you call intertidal guardians, right? Which reminds me of Terry Lynn's work on the flood tide woman, right? And I think these sort of kind of ways of reaching for a sort of speculative sort of multi-species relations through these figures is really beautiful. And so I would like for us to open this conversation by returning to those questions that Denise, I think you wrote, right, to open this panel, and particularly the second question, which is, how do expanses of water, floods, and reclaimed shorelines challenge or redefine sovereignty, right? And so just to push that a bit further, I'm thinking, how might the flood, right, the coming flood, help us to deconstruct colonial infrastructures? And what do we need to construct new systems of relation and power redistribution in the water's wake? And this, I had to think about earlier, LAIWAN, when we were talking about, the fact that when we see these new waves of climate refugees, right, that they're not going to just be human, right? They're going to be multi-species climate refugees. And I was thinking that this is very much connected to this idea that Morgan Guerin shared with us, which is, how do we learn to live with our new relatives, right? And if we are committed to seeing through a multi-species relational perspective, it's all really connected, right? So Morgan Guerin also said, the sooner the narrative of I have dominion dies, the faster we can get onto a global healing. And so with this question, I'm hoping to bring all of these concepts back together. And also Marianne Nicholson's idea that the language is shifting, right? But structural problems remain. So how do we really get to a sort of material engagement with that question of how do we build a new world, as the one that we've grown into is flooded or washed away, hopefully. Yeah, and then that last question of that trifecta is, how do expanses of water, floods, and reclaimed shorelines decolonize the map? Which reminded me of Alice Depunga Somerville's opening poem, where she said, there are no centers and we are all nodes. So I hope that instigated some kind of answer in you. I'll join you now so we can get to the discussion.
Is this on? There you are. It's very late at night for me. Thank you so much for all of the many provocations. Maybe I'll just start off with something that you ended with, which is the question of sovereignty and shorelines. And I guess for me, the question of sovereignty and the demarcation of states is really sort of generative for me to kind of go subaquatic. So instead of thinking horizontally, to think vertically, and that's a kind of lateral move that brings in the ecological, but also brings in the speculative by or a kind of fictioning, which rather than being a kind of flight of fantasy, has a kind of traction on the real, which in a way you can tell a story that hits closer to home by just stepping a little bit to the side and telling it in a kind of askew way. And I feel like for me, the kind of boundaries of, say, my project on the cable was strangely only manageable by imagining the forest underwater, and then suddenly that was, and then suddenly the forest became indistinguishable from the people who were sort of punitively acted against after the revolt of 1857. So I guess I'll maybe just stop there for now and pass it on.
Is this one on? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Ayesha, for those three questions. They've all blurred into my mind now, so I'm not sure which one to answer. I think for me, the question of the role of aesthetics and in what ways we can provide more resources to those entities that need it, including the critters, including all who are homeless, which include the critters and all the human homeless. And how do we build habitat? And does aesthetics contribute to building habitat, and in what ways? Something that I think we can do as artists is model other ways of being and other imaginings. So I do think that aesthetics does provide imagination, but I also think there has to be some kind of, I think we talked about class analysis earlier, which is how do we bridge our privileged positions, perhaps as artists, and engage with the land as it is. And I think earlier, I think it was Morgan who had said, Mother Earth has lost her hair. And how do we replenish that? Because making more things still takes resources. So the question for me now is, how do we replenish those resources? How do we nourish and feed? And that includes both human, but also other habitats that the non-human requires so as to survive. And that in turn is our survival. Those to me are really key. Thank you.
I know we're close to time, so I can keep it short. I love what you just said around like different imaginaries and relationality. For me, as a scholar and a curator and the work I do in terms of supporting artists and trying to think through different ways of uplifting the work that you all are doing is around surfacing, right? The work that's happening that artists are engaging in with regards to providing different imaginaries of these futures and these presents that are already happening. One group of artists who I dearly love as collaborators, as people, our Super Futures Haunt Collective. And the work they do, there's 3 of them, Siri of Samjung and Angie Morel. Angie is Modoc Klamath from Oregon. Siri and Sam are diasporic Korean Americans based in California and New York, respectively. And the practices, they perform as future ghosts. That's the persona that they take, and they do these things called visitations and hauntings. And they're not scary ghosts; they're playful, fun, karaoke singing ghosts. But the places that they haunt, right, are these really complex sites of anti-Asian violence, indigenous dispossession, and capitalism. Like they haunt shopping malls sometimes in Koreatown in LA. And for me, when I work with artists like this, or when I begin to work or write about artists like Martha Atienza, right, there's this desire on my part, right, to help surface, right, some of these submerged narratives that they're playing with. And then part of it too is in terms of what we do or what we can do in the realms that we're in the role that I have as a curator, is to actually materially move resources, right, so that you all can continue to do the work that you're doing and not cheap ways, right? Because the work you're doing is more than just about getting things up for individual exposure or white cube kind of presentation, but is actually, right, itself kind of manifesting a different relationship to community and a different relationship to exchange economy that I think is really important at a very materialist redistribution kind of level.
Can I say something kind of weird? I think it might connect to your question about artistic practice, or maybe not, but the previous panel that we saw or we attended was mostly on Zoom and had this kind of AI captioning. And it was kind of, I'm very sorry, this is very middle of the night sort of thought, but I've been thinking a lot about the kind of colonizing epistemic violence of language, and how most of us, English is not our ancestral language, and yet it's the one we're using, and how do you think of resistance to it? But so there was some terrible violences done by that AI bot, which I'm sure all of us noted. And I was like, oh, how can I not see this? And then I started thinking that actually it's just really exposing the epistemic violence within the language that is already there. It's like a kind of surfacing, right? A surfacing of what is actually kind of camouflaged more, but it's the kind of the valuation of quote unquote otherness, right? But just sort of thinking about, alliances with the non-human, we're thinking of nature, but then this weird AI bot sort of exposes something as well. And, it's very hard to think of nature as being this sort of pristine, sort of a priori thing. It's, we're all kind of intertwined, and I really don't know how I'm ending the sentence, but I do feel like there's something in that, the artifice and the exposure of the artifice in that, and particularly with those presentations and the kind of really difficult and really thoughtful histories that were being recounted, and to sort of have that at the same time, the dissonance that created sort of was a kind of epiphany for me about the kind of surfacing and the depths and the kind of thinking about, the role of artistry, artifice, and fictioning.
I mean, if anybody wants to continue to address Ayesha's questions and comments, please do. I'm just going to start surveying the room for any questions, and I should also survey the chat, but I keep forgetting about the chat. If anybody's streaming and they have questions, submit them now. Is there a? There is a question in the chat. Oh, okay. I'm gonna. Sorry, let the link expire. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just jump in and like respond to that?
Yes, please do.
That was cracking me up too. I was like, oh, is that how that word comes out in like Zoomese or whatever? And oh, thank you. Yeah, so it was cracking me up. But I must admit, and maybe it's because the first place I went was humour. I thought it was really interesting to think about the kind of incapacity for these kind of AI regimes to actually capture or even understand, like the way that like our actual genuine language and interaction is unable to be, kind of sucked into that, that captioning or whatever. And I can appreciate that there are people for whom that captioning is really important, and I'm not wanting to like undermine that. But I also thought, like, just thinking about this idea of what kinds of work or whatever is kind of possible beyond the like totally depressing everything. I think it's those moments that are uncapturable. Those kind of moments of genuine, like the machine can't keep up with the ways that we keep either extending, Indigenous languages, because it was Indigenous languages that were getting like, fried, but also our different accents that didn't know what to do with actually any of the three of us who were speaking. All obviously don't speak the appropriate version of English to be kind of legible. And I wonder what happens if we flip it the other way and say that's like, maybe that can kind of point to the possibilities of celebrating, that's such a, not the right word, but like kind of noticing these spaces where that are unable to be captured by these kinds of technologies as a kind of broader metaphor for something.
Yeah, I think you're right. It exposes it, right?
Right. Yeah.
All kinds of things. Oh, yeah. That's all. Should I say that again? Yeah, it just exposes it, and that exposure is kind of horrifying and a kind of moment of possibility. Because how do you kind of configure resistance when the word resistance is English, which is the language of the colonizer? Right. It's the flip side of the same coin. But then you have this eruption and.
Because there's something like I've noticed that there's been a lot of language around invisibility and things that aren't known, things people have never heard of, but the people that are there have heard of them. Do you know what I mean? Or like, and I use that language a lot too, and I think it's really useful. But just thinking about maybe not everything is to be known, and maybe the ideal outcome all the time isn't revelation, right? Because once it's revealed and knowable, then it can be kind of sucked into the machine, right? That's just something that I've kind of noticed, that we've kind of, that language has come up, and I understand the language and I use it myself, but yeah.
I apologize to whoever's asking a question in the chat. I seem to not have anything showing up. So it's probably my, I don't know, inability to work this thing. And I apologize to anyone who's been asking in other panels that I just didn't see. I had one job to do while I'm up here, and sorry.
I just wanted to follow up on the comment. I was, while I agree that you can call it epistemic violence, and not that you can call it, it is, I was quite enjoying how language was morphing and what you can do with it. I'm always amused, delighted, frustrated by the autocorrect on the cell phone. And often, I was writing absolutely the other day and it said something else, and I thought, oh, that's really fascinating. I'll try and use that word, maybe as a writer and a poet. I just wanted to add that, but my question was to Dr. Thea and the images of the video and this idea of contamination, because I felt very much like a voyeur watching that. I was exceedingly uncomfortable. And I wondered if you knew how deliberate that was. having done a work in which I was wanting to contaminate the reader to the work, I just wondered if that was something that, I'm sorry, I forget her name, whether that's something that she was conscious about, because I felt almost sullied by it and felt like I didn't have a right to be seeing that. And what could I do with this information? What's my responsibility apart from being pissed off in Toronto when I see the Filipino nannies in the park, but that's easy, I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that and if other people in the audience or the panel felt similarly.
Thank you so much for that question. In terms of her explicit intention, I can only at this moment kind of guess at it. One part is it has been exceedingly difficult to contact her. I contact her through her gallery. I don't have a personal relationship with her yet. And the first time I tried to contact and was about to, set up a Zoom meeting, because I was living in Seattle at the time, and she's relocated from Manila to Bantayan Island, which is very hard to get to. It was February 2020. So with COVID and everything like that, I fell off in the contact. More recently, we did try to have her presentation of this work for the gallery here. And one thing, not just from the experience of wanting to show her work here, but also at another institution where a curator colleague of mine who introduced me to the work also had trouble showing it, was there are very specific screening requirements for her to agree to show the work. They do have to be projected at a certain size, at a certain scale. So there is a very specific intention, backlit, that it look like an aquarium, right? That it be that large, that you encounter it in a dark room, that they are life-size before you, and that it does look like a glass aquarium. So that being said, I think it's hard not to be uncomfortable when you look at that and think of even a longer history of displays of Filipino indigenous people in human zoos in the United States and all over the world, as evidence of us as closer to Blackness and as evidence of savagery, right? And many other artists like Stephanie Sujuco in the US and Alejandro Acierto deal with that history of the visibilizing of Filipino indigeneity as Blackness and savagery. So I think in that context, just of the global circulation of Filipino objection, of Filipino bodies, right, being shown in these distressing scenes, I think she is wanting us to think of that, to be uncomfortable with that, but perhaps also to recognize something else. Like, these folks are very much enduring and not in a kind of corny way, like they're actively pushing through. Like, these are trained compressor divers. And, compression diving, there's no fancy equipment. It's just a tube that goes up to the surface, and it gets filled with water. It's incredibly dangerous, the kind of work that they do. And they still do it, right? Because they have to do it, and it's not pleasurable or joyful. But at least in this moment, there has been something transformed, because they have worked really closely with the queer and Bakla performers to craft this other spectacle that's something more than just fishing for survival. But anyways, I'm sorry, I know we have other things to do tonight and other questions, but I do think we are supposed to be made deeply uncomfortable. And I hope that, I don't know, we can do something more than just sit with the discomfort, right? But maybe in this case, I want to show it and think about how do we mobilize funds for, the land defenders and left activists in the Philippines. And I won't name them here because the state is watching. But if folks have want to know more about that, I'm happy to talk with you all in person after off mic about that.
Thanks, Alex, for bringing me your laptop. So I'll just, maybe in the interest of time, we might just sit with this question, but Brady Fullerton asks, today's talks have built an exciting discourse and tension between entanglement and the importance of place. How do the panelists understand the artist's role as accountable to their own entangled identity? their alliance and solidarity and respect for the land, water, and water-permeated land on which they create. So Brady, you get the closing question for today, or comment, and maybe we'll come back tomorrow and think further on that. And yeah, thank you very much. And again, thank you, Ayasha, Ayesha, Thea, and LAIWAN.